Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first Eminent Speakers series of 2021, hosted by Law Reform and Social Justice, the ANU College of Law and Amnesty International. My name is Peter Bulling. I'm an environmental scientist, activist, and honours law student here at the ANU. During the day, I work as a biodiversity campaigner with the Conservation Council here in the ACT and a research advocate at GreenLaw. But this evening, I am delighted to play the role of your guide as we traverse the fascinating field of climate change and human rights during COP26. All right. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge that I am zooming in this morning from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I'm very fortunate to live and work on their lands. I recognise all elders, past and present, and their continuing stewardship of the land around me, from which I personally glean so much inspiration. I would also like to acknowledge any First Nations peoples who are joining us this evening, particularly Tony, one of our wonderful speakers tonight. I hope that every person feels comfortable to participate in this evening's discussion, particularly those of you with Indigenous heritage. Finally, I would also like to pay my respects to the rest of the speakers this evening and recognise that each of them comes to this discussion with a rich tapestry of cultural heritage and experience that we will no doubt get to learn from this evening. I'll go on to introduce each of them in turn, but prior to that, I'd just like to acknowledge their perspectives, culture, and welcome them to this discussion. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what I expect will be a fascinating and robust talk, I would like to give a quick shout out to one of our hosts this evening, the Law Reform and Social Justice Hub at the ANU, or better known by students as LRSJ. In addition to putting on great events like this one, LRSJ facilitates a broad range of student projects across the university and supports an active approach to legal study at the ANU. I myself have been a beneficiary of the great work that they do through their support of the creation of GreenLaw, a youth-led environmental justice organisation. Now, before I pass the mic over to Sam from Amnesty International, the other co-host of this evening, I'd like to take this moment to encourage any students in the crowd who are passionate about making the world a better place or a fairer place to reach out to LRSJ or GreenLaw to see what opportunities are out there for you. All right, over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you everybody for giving up your evening this evening to come along for what is going to be an absolutely fantastic conversation. Thank you also for the opportunity to welcome everyone on behalf of Amnesty International. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm meeting from this evening, and that's the beautiful land of the Yugambeh people, and I acknowledge their elders past and present and extend this respect to all First Nations people joining us this evening. I would like to acknowledge also that sovereignty was never ceded. This is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's important to acknowledge also, in light of the conversation that we're having tonight, the intersectional relationship between climate justice and Indigenous justice. We recently consulted our movement last year, in fact, in relation to our key priority areas for our next strategic vision period from 2021 to 2025. We had just under 8,000 people participate in that consultation, and it was very clear from their responses that our movement believes climate change is a significant human rights issue for us to campaign on. As well as the national interest, our global movement is also very engaged, right to the level of having representatives attending COP26, including our Secretary General, Dr. Agnes Callamard. And we locally and nationally and internationally are primed to be responsive throughout COP and will be watching keenly and following. I recently had the opportunity to meet with the Ambassador for Environment and outline our 5 key recommendations to the Australian Government in the lead up to COP26. I'd like to briefly outline those now. Firstly, a stronger emissions reduction target for 2030 and not 2050. We believe that this is the single most important thing for the government to do ahead of COP26. From a human rights perspective, the bottom line is that COP26 must keep alive prospects of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and that demands that global emissions be roughly halved this decade. Almost all of the world's advanced economies have now substantially strengthened their 2030 emission reduction targets, and Australia has not. Amnesty's position is that Australia should be aiming for zero emissions by 2030, As a first step, Australia must at least match updated commitments from other wealthy nations, and shortly after that submit an NDC aligned with the imperative of limiting the global average temperature rise to 1.5%. Our second key priority is making sure that Australia makes a fair share to the global climate finance. We know that progress on climate finance will also be fundamental to success in Glasgow, beginning with developed countries being able to demonstrate that they are delivering on the long-standing promise to provide US $100 billion per year. This is also a matter of human rights and justice for the world's most vulnerable communities, who have contributed little to the causes of climate change, but are hit first and hardest by its impacts. While recognising that Australia's climate finance has been all in the form of grants and has given appropriate priority to adaptation, we have only contributed a relatively small amount towards that shared goal, and we need to follow other countries in significantly increasing our contribution. Importantly, we strongly encourage that the government recommence contributions to the Green Climate Fund, noting that this has been a consistent request from our Pacific neighbours. Our third priority is finance for loss and damage. We urge that Australia support the priorities of our Pacific neighbours when it comes to much needed progress from COP26 on action to address loss and damage, in particular ensuring that COP26 leads to new and additional funding to address loss and damage. Our fourth priority is phasing out fossil fuels. Australia must get on board with this. The priority should be to reduce absolute emissions by urgently phasing out fossil fuels. We cannot rely on offsetting emissions from the continued burning of fossil fuels through carbon markets and unproven carbon removal technologies, or through changes in land use that may carry grave human rights implications, such as reducing land available for growing food. To keep the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degree alive, there is no room for new fossil fuels. However, Australia continues to approve and even fund new coal and gas projects, in many cases against the wishes of our First Nations communities. Australia must join other countries in agreeing to phase out coal no later than 2030 and commit to ending all public funding for fossil fuels. And lastly, in relation to carbon markets, as I said before, we believe that the priority should be on fossil fuel phase out. However, in the context of the negotiations on the implementation rules for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, it is vital that the rules for international carbon markets serve to drive greater overall ambition in emissions reductions, that they rule out the carryover credits from the Kyoto period, and they ensure appropriate human rights safeguards. We welcome Australia's recognition of the importance of safeguarding human rights in Article 6 at the June 2021 intersessional meeting and urge Australia to make this a red line that cannot be compromised in the course of the negotiations. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from all of the speakers tonight. I know that they have so much to offer us, and this is a great opportunity for us to engage in good conversation and certainly to learn from one another. And I will hand back over to you now, Peter, to kick off with our first speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. It's really wonderful to hear about the work that Amnesty is doing. There is an Amnesty International petition that you can all sign. The link has just been posted in the chat for you. I hope everybody can see that. All right, so I'm very proud to be introducing our speakers this evening, Tony McAvoy, Fololo Tupuola, Sanjula Weerasinghe, and Annika Reynolds. Now, before we dive into discussion, each speaker will have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about their perspective on human rights and climate change. First up in the hot seat tonight is Tony McAvoy. Tony is a Wiradjuri man from Central Queensland. He is a barrister and was appointed Senior Counsel in 2015. Notably, he is Australia's first Indigenous Senior Counsel. Tony is an expert in native title practice, environmental law, administrative law, human rights and discrimination law, coronial inquests, and criminal law. He has written on the notion of Indigenous rights in Australia and the impacts of those rights in a climate change policy vacuum. Thank you for joining us this evening, Tony. I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you, Peter. And I must say, catching up with the news from Glasgow this evening, I was rather disappointed to hear that our Prime Minister had not given us much hope in meeting any of the objectives that Amnesty International had set out as its primary objectives to come out of COP. There is some way to go, but this country and our present leadership leaves us all with a great degree of embarrassment and guilt at our country not doing its share and pulling its weight. I'm going to speak tonight about First Nations and climate change. I do want to speak first about the right to self-determination. Globally, First Nations have been in a state of transition since the 1960s. Process often referred to as decolonisation has been underway, and the principle that First Nations are entitled to be self-determining has been recognised internationally, but not implemented domestically. The rights of Indigenous people, as you all know, were formally recognised by adoption by the United Nations General Assembly of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007. It's notable that Australia, along with New Zealand, Canada and the United States, opposed the declaration in the UN General Assembly, but they have all since endorsed the declaration, with Australia giving its endorsement in 2009. The principal collective right, though, articulated in the declaration is the right to self-determination. That right underpins the call in the Uluru Statement from the Heart for Constitutional Amendment to insert a role for a body representative of First Nations. So, although the proposal does not call for decision-making powers, the capacity to be heard is I think, a type of self-determination. In my experience, though, self-determination is often understood by First Nations people to mean the same as sovereignty. Even though First Nations perspectives of sovereignty might not be precisely the same as it is understood at international law. The Uluru Statement refers to First Nations sovereignty being a spiritual notion. This expression is borrowed from the 1975 International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the Western Sahara and the later judgment of Justice Brennan in the High Court of Australia in Mabo No. 2. In the ICJ decision, it was recorded that the member of the court representing Zaire noted that the doctrine of terra nullius should be substituted by a spiritual notion. It was said, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the man who was born therefrom remains attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with his ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. This amounts to a denial of the very concept of terra nullius in the sense of a land which is capable of being appropriated by someone who was not born therefrom. That articulation of the relationship between people and land is something that resonates very strongly with First Nations people in this country, from my observations, and indeed with all First Nations peoples, from people I've spoken to and from what I've heard. And so it's in the context of this expression of self-determination from the standpoint of a sovereign that we find a particular clash between the failure in Australia to domestically legislate for human rights that protect those sovereign rights and those rights to self-determination. In Australia, we have not seen any domestic implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, nor have we seen implementation of the International Convention on the Civil and Political Rights, or the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And the consequence of that is that in Australia, we don't have a legislative basis, nationally at least, for prosecution of human rights in a manner which can be used to delay or prohibit or oppose the continued emission of greenhouse gases and the contributions this country makes to the climate change scenarios in the way that other countries can. So we've seen internationally there have been many forms of litigation based essentially upon the rights which are articulated in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, amongst others. We do not have a legislated right to life in this country, and so how that translates for Indigenous people is that you see the complaint under the first optional protocol, I think, made to the ICCPR, made by the Torres Strait Islanders, the people from Masig and other low-lying islands in the Torres Strait. Their claims are in relation to rights to express their and to their cultural rights, right to life, the right to sustenance. And the only place that they've been able to take that is to the UN Human Rights Committee, which, of course, as we know, cannot make any binding decisions which affect Australia. All that can be done is that recommendations can be made. So for Indigenous people, the absence of the right to self-determine and the recognition of any sovereign right really leaves us at the mercy of the nation state. Now, in countries such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States of America, the failure of this imported British system to even contemplate a flawed sovereignty in any political or legal sense makes this right to the exercise of a right to self-determination within that system a poor but important second-order outcome. By this I mean that under the imported British system, the colonies, the countries of Australia and Canada, the US, they determine the manner and extent to which self-determination is exercised. And that judgment is an administrative judgment, and that it can't be challenged in any court. So my view was that while something might be better than nothing, self-determination under conditions where the people who are your oppressors determine the conditions of that self-determination remains a very poor second outcome. I understand from my work with the Law Council of Australia that the Australian Human Rights Commission is continuing pressure for a federal Human Rights Act as one of its key measures, and it's something that we've approached in this country a number of times but never been able to achieve. It's as fundamental, in my opinion, more fundamental than having a federal ICAC or even legislation which ensures that Indigenous land rights are protected, because without the protection of those fundamental human rights, we remain at the mercy of the government of the day. And so people tend to forget that while we're talking about climate change, in the Northern Territory, the Aboriginal people have been subjected to an intervention which affects their ability to live their lives in the same way as the rest of the community for now approaching 15 years. And governments of both persuasions have had the opportunity to repeal that legislation, but they haven't done so. I know I've drifted around a little bit here, but the issues of self-determination and sovereignty and the protection of our environment are all so closely intertwined for First Nations people. So I suppose where the rubber hits the road in terms of the exercise of sovereign power against First Nations people can be seen in the protest that's currently going on at the Adani mining lease. So traditional owners are camped out on the mining lease, and Adani are seeking to have the police remove those traditional owners from their mining lease. And so the police are the enforcement arm of the sovereign, and the sovereign, the sovereign in the form of the Crown and the right of the state of Queensland, is exercising its might to remove people who are asserting an equal and an original sovereign power that is said not to have been displaced. And where there is no legislation and no capacity to otherwise litigate, people are resorting to direct action. And but that's the end product of it, that the police are called and the colonial sovereign power is exercised. I'm conscious of time. I'll leave it there and wait for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony. You were perfectly on time there. Stopped right on track. Well done. That was very interesting. I'm really looking forward to discussing some of those ideas later on. The next speaker, who I am very excited to introduce everybody to, is Folole Tupuola. Folole is a storyteller and artist of Samoan descent. She advocates for climate and social justice through a lens of cultural resilience and artistic healing with and for Oceania. Folole brings to light mental well-being, activism, and decolonization as a young Pacific Diaspora youth. She is also the Pacific Climate Warriors Coordinator in Victoria. So thank you for zooming in, Folole. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Womenjeka, Oa'u Folole Asawa Sanjula Weerasinghe. I carry my father's village of Si'umu, my mother's village of Vailima, and the namesake and matriarch, my grandmother, who still lives in the village of Moa, which is not too far away from my grandmother, Atonia, who lives in the seaside of Matautu. Aotearoa mai Wathaurong people's land, I too want to pay my respects to the custodians of the unceded and stolen country that I am settled in, and acknowledge the racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and the ongoing colonization forced on this land. I too pay my respects to the elders past, those with us, to you, Tony McAvoy, and your ancestors, to the spirits of the land, waters, and the dream time, and to all First Nations people here with us, and that climate justice is First Nations and Indigenous leadership. Talofa, talofa, talofa lava. It is with great honor to learn alongside esteemed guests and with you all. Whaftai lava to the organizers and to all peoples for this yarn. I am Many, a grassroots youth-led network of 18 ocean nations and diaspora across Aotearoa, Turtle Island, and here in so-called Australia. Together we make up Pacific Climate Warriors. Since 2011, we have been mobilizing, organizing, and upskilling our peoples on leadership and taking action on climate change in the Pacific that is greatly contributed by the fossil fuel industry, as we all know. We are a volunteer branch to 350 Pacific and the global movement. We fight to keep all fossil fuels in the ground, adjust, transition to renewable energy, and to cut all flow of fossil fuel finances. The core of our work is rooted in our culture and our frontline truths. Shifting the narrative of victimhood to real climate leaders, women-led, and with the solutions that to save the Pacific is to save the world and all of humanity. Like our family in the Marshall Islands who fought and led the urgent action for a 1.5 target in the Paris Agreement, to the greatest ocean navigators, the Chamorro peoples who lead clean energy solutions through traditional navigating practices, to the nuclear-free campaign advocated by the youth, such as our ANU academic, Tale Lucia Mengioni, and to the Pacific Island Student Fighting for Climate Change group, with their endorse the advisory opinion campaign to the International Court of Justice. Last month, Pacific Climate Warriors hosted the largest youth mobilization conference in the region, called the Youth for Pacific Pre-COP Gathering. More than 600 Pacific peoples and diaspora, including myself, came together to collaborate and unify youth advocacy and engagement in climate policy in the lead up to Glasgow. The outcome was the creation of a declaration with 7 urgent demands, which serve as the voice of the young leaders in the region and will be hand-delivered to our resilient Pacific leaders and elders on Thursday. The demands cover the push for youth leadership. Together with our world leaders, we are calling for a curb carbon emissions by at least 50% by 2030 through the just and urgent transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And I also want to echo the Pacific Island Forum's statement, who call for emissions cuts now. I also recognize the traditional environmental knowledge and crucial and must be woven into designing ocean policies. A financial transparency, as Sam has mentioned, with the Santiago network, and ensuring grant distribution, not apathetic loans. A just people's recovery, shifting away from the extractive economies to a constructive economy that are recognized by ocean cultures. This is all about building ambition, building community, building skills, and building Pacific power. And as the last generation to do something about it now. The Warriors revived the Have Your Say campaign back in 2017 when Fiji chaired the COP23, where the Pacific showed the world what true climate leadership is. It was a unique campaign that brought folks to engage and contribute to the work and to be part of the journey through the symbolism of this lovely red say, showcasing the beauty, womanhood, and resilience. Hence, this COP26, Pacific Climate Warriors have launched the 7 days of 7 actions to commemorate the 7 urgent demands from the youth. Our network will host online and in-person community events that have already started, and that is to strengthen and amplify the signing. Like our warriors in Fiji, who are hosting a Have Your Say festival, to our mighty warriors in Tonga, who are organizing a youth camp, to our TikToks, Instagram filters, and to our diaspora warriors in Melbourne, who are pressuring Australia's major banks to divest from all fossil fuels in their policy plan through Digital Storm. And we also have our Defund Climate Chaos online rally by our dear friends and allies of Stop Adani that is actually happening right now. A deadly sister, and something that is also echoed through Tony, a deadly sister and founder of Seed Mob, Millie Telford, had stated that if you're not prepared and you don't know what leadership looks like, get out of the way and let First Nations people lead. As mentioned by Tony, let the 8 Torres Strait Islander claymates UN landmark against the Australian government. Let the Wangan and Jangalungu peoples fighting against what will be Australia's largest illegal coal mine, the Adani. Let the traditional owners in Northern Territory protecting the sacred waters of the Beetaloo Basin from Morrison's gas-led recovery plan, influencing gas corporations such as Origin Energy. Let the West Papuan movement reclaim self-determination from the UN inaction on the forced occupation of Indonesia and Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade enabling. Let there be social justice for First Nations people who have the highest number of desecrations in the world and with 0 criminal prosecutions. As an Oceania region that has always been led by youth leaders who are standing in solidarity collectively, we want to see a just transitioning from global extractive economies to local living economies, all connected in shared values of dignity, solidarity, respect, and care. I also stand in solidarity with the on-campus movement as a former student to urgently extend this to Australian National University as an institution to take action on ending all fossil fuel investments and finances, to lead by example and to divest now. And before I share a beautiful Have Your Say video, I want to share this from our youth elder, Brianna Fruin, who spoke at the opening of the Leaders Summit in Glasgow not too long ago. And she shared a Samoan proverb that goes, "E pala le ma'a, e pala le upu," which means even stones decay, but words endure. We are not drowning, we are fighting. I'll just take a couple of seconds just to sort this out.
During the global climate strikes in September this year, the Pacific came together in a different way. More than 600 young, strong, and proud Pacific Islander voices formed the Youth for Pacific Declaration on Climate Change. We, the youth from the Pacific, and the Pacific youth in the diaspora, representing frontline communities, grassroots organizations, youth networks, and Indigenous peoples. We call on our global leaders to respond to the challenge of this time. Respond to the climate crisis through an intersectional lens that prioritizes justice. That promotes inclusive and just world for ourselves and the future generations to come. At this year's COP26 climate negotiations in Glasgow, we will deliver the voice of Pacific youth to our leaders. Now is your chance to join us. Now is your chance to have your say on why you are fighting for your future. Sign the Youth for Pacific Declaration on Climate Change and have your say.
Wow, that was incredibly moving. Thank you so much, Folole, for everything. Is there anything else you'd like to say? If not, we'll move on to our next speaker. While we're in this brief intermission stage, I'd just like to reflect quickly on something Folole said, and that is, to save the Pacific is to save humanity. I mean, that is such an incredibly powerful quote, and I wrote it down, and I just think that's something that we can all sit and reflect on and mull over. All right, so the next speaker, who I'm very proud to introduce to you all, is Sanjula Weerasinghe. Sanjula works at the intersection of international law, the humanitarian crises, and displacement. Based in Geneva, she is an independent consultant with the UN Network on Migration. She is also an advisory member to the advisory committee of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and an affiliate of the Andrew and Renata Kaldor Center for International Refugee Law at UNSW. Thank you for joining us this evening, Sanjula. It's great to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to Amnesty International and LRSJ as well for the invitation. After those very powerful and moving presentations, I feel quite ashamed to be presenting somewhat more of a technical presentation on how different dimensions of mobility intersect with climate change. But that is my task, and that is what I'm planning to do. So let me just share with you a slideshow that I prepared to communicate 4 key messages. So please just let me know if you can see that. Can everyone see those slides? Okay, great. So as I said, and as you said, Peter, what I've been doing is working at the intersection of kind of climate change and human mobility, primarily based here in Geneva, and looking at these issues from a research and policy perspective. And there are 4 kind of key messages that I want to share. The first one of these is really that there are often 4 common conceptual categories of movement. We look at displacement, and we consider displacement as the predominantly forced movement. And then we look at migration as predominantly voluntary movement. But both from a conceptual perspective and from a practice perspective, differentiating between these 2 extremes is quite challenging. A simplistic scenario for displacement is a situation where, for instance, people might have to evacuate in the context of fire. And because of the immediacy of that evacuation, you can see that it's compelled movement. On the other hand, with migration, you may see that people might engage in a seasonal migration program and travel elsewhere for about 3 months and return home because of changes in their environment, that affect their livelihoods. But outside some of those relatively clear boundaries, trying to work out what really does amount to predominantly forced movement and what amounts to predominantly voluntary movement is really challenging. Then there's another category of movement that's come across in the context of COP discussions, in particular the Cancun Adaptation Framework, and that's planned relocation. And this is something also that comes up quite often in the Pacific. And it's a situation where groups of communities are relocating from their homes and are settled in another location, but this time permanently. And finally, the last category relates to immobility. And within the context of immobility, you can also have 2 subcategories. People who actually do not have the resources or the physical capability to move, for example, because of their age or their gender, or lack of financial and other resource capacities. And people who actually still want to stay where they are, recognizing the adverse effects of climate change on their livelihoods, on their living conditions, on their environment, but wanting to fight and stay and adapt as best as they can within the confines of the changes that are happening in their environment. So the first point to really kind of understand is that there are these 4 categories of movement. Sometimes differentiating between them, particularly in practice, can be challenging. The second dimension that I want to understand, and there's a kind of 4 subcategories to this, is these different aspects of geography, temporality, causality, and multiple kind of movements. And this is because not understanding these different dimensions can be problematic when you're considering what the rights implications are, and can be problematic when you're trying to design targeted policies and programs to support affected people. So on geography, one of the key things to recognise is that most movements are within countries. Most movements that are associated with disasters and climate change are within countries. The most robust data that we have is on internal displacement, and that's because the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre has, for the last 10 or more years, been developing global estimates of the number of people that are displaced within their countries in the context of disasters. And for 2020, we know that over 30 million people were displaced in the context of disasters. Most of these people, the vast majority, were displaced in the context of storms and floods, the types of weather-related hazards that we know are increasing in intensity and frequency because of the effects of climate change. For planned relocation too, recent studies have found that there are at least 400 cases of planned relocation that have occurred across the globe in at least 60 countries in all regions of the world, with Pacific again being a hotspot. All of those relocations of communities have been internal and within countries. There is some cross-border displacement, that is occurring, but we do not have global estimates. But even when it does occur, what we do know is that it's often across national borders or within regions. Now, when it comes to migration, again, we also don't have a global data set. And part of the reason for not having a global data set on how many people are moving with climate change factors as part of their reasons for moving is because of multi-causality. None of the movements that occur in the context of climate change occur solely because of climate change. People's decisions on movement are often influenced by environmental factors, such as the way climate change may affect a hazard, but also other socioeconomic and political factors. So you can imagine that the way that a government addresses disaster risk reduction plays a role. The way that a government addresses market opportunities and livelihood opportunities can play a role. So those are the governance-related factors. And we've already heard the cultural and socioeconomic dynamics that also affect people's decision-making. And the last thing to think about with multi-causality as well is that in some parts of the world, and particularly say in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, conflict and disaster overlap. Also in Afghanistan, there are countries where these dynamics of violence and conflict really overlap and undermine people's resilience. So both of those factors can also affect people's movement decisions. Then the next dimension relates to temporality, and here, I mean, it's just about understanding that movements can occur across different time horizons. Again, if you think about an evacuation scenario, such as in the context of a flood, you can see that people may evacuate in the immediacy of the flood, but return soon after if their houses haven't been damaged too much. Another category of people may return 3 to 4 weeks later, once kind of key repairs to their homes have been undertaken. But for another category of people, depending on the ongoing risks, depending on future risk scenarios, return may not be an option. And so onward movement, settlement elsewhere through relocation may be their only option that's available to them. So that's the third dimension, understanding that these types of movements, displacement and migration in particular, can happen across different time horizons. And then the last point to understand with respect to this slide is that the same people can face repeated displacement scenarios. So you can imagine a flood situation such as in Bangladesh, for example, where people face repeated storms or repeated floods, but keep going back to their homes. So every year or every season, they're displaced to an evacuation centre and keep going back to their homes. But after a number of years, they become fed up with that way of living, and that way of living becomes unmanageable. And they decide to migrate internally to Dhaka, for example. There are also other scenarios, such as in Somalia, where people might displace initially because of conflict and move to an internal displacement camp. And then subsequently floods or a drought may hit that area where they're living, and then they have to move again. So these are kind of 4 key dimensions of human mobility that's worth appreciating, because they have implications for the way that you consider what rights are affected, and then how you design policies and practices to address those issues. The 4th point then that I want to talk about is in relation to some of the applicable frameworks. So as I said, all of these dimensions of geography, temporality, causality, and kind of multiple movements affect policies and programs. But what's important to understand here is that there's also just a range of policy frameworks that can be used to both assist and protect people who are affected by climate change and disasters, and who are moving or need to move in the context of climate change and disasters. For a long time, much of the policy debate on kind of displacement associated with climate change and disasters has focused on refugee law and has focused on cross-border movements, because it was in relation to cross-border movements that there was a recognition that there's a protection gap in terms of admission, stay, and status. But as you would have already gathered from the discussion that we've had so far, most movement is not cross-border. Most movement is, in fact, internal. And so while refugee law is relevant, it's only really a a quite small piece of the puzzle. All of these other frameworks that I've highlighted here are also relevant to considering how to protect and assist people. So in this context, and given the debate had focused on refugee law, one of the actions and one of the processes that really provided a lot more clarity to the discourse on movement associated with disasters and climate change was a 2015 agenda that was developed by the state-led Nansen Initiative. And what the Nansen Initiative's protection agenda did was highlight a so-called toolbox of approaches that recognised the range of multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary actions that are needed to address different facets of human mobility at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level, and the global level. And that approach essentially focuses on three key areas of action. The first one is around, well, how do you help people stay where they want to stay? Despite risks and despite exposure, what are the interventions that are needed to help people stay where they want to stay? And if you look at that previous slide I showed you, disaster risk reduction efforts can help people stay where they want to stay. Climate change adaptation efforts can help people stay where they want to stay, and development frameworks are then also relevant for helping people stay where they want to stay. And of course, human rights law comes into this equation as well, making sure that people's rights are protected in the places that they're staying. The second kind of category of action focused on trying to expand opportunities for people to move out of harm's way in a preventative manner or in an adaptive manner. So that includes kind of migration pathways within countries, moving away from areas particularly at risk of hazards, but also still staying within their countries and staying in places that people would like to stay rather than crossing borders. Equally, promoting cross-border migration pathways is also necessary where cross-border movement is a choice and a desire. And finally, the third category of actions relates to trying to protect people who are displaced and trying to find solutions for people who are displaced as well. And that relates to those who are internally displaced, which is the majority of people across the globe, but also people who may be displaced across borders. So finally, just to finish up and then bring it back to the COP discussions, these issues of human mobility and climate change first came up really in the Cancun adaptation framework over 10 years ago, where displacement and migration and planned relocation were mentioned as approaches that could help people's adaptation efforts. Since then, human mobility has also been mentioned in the context of loss and damage discussions, including at COP18. And then at COP21, there was a mandate to establish a task force on displacement. And this task force has gone through kind of 2 phases of activity. It's in its second phase of activity. And that first phase of activity really provided a range of recommendations on how to avert, minimise and address displacement. And then the second phase builds on that work to try and continue to do the same, but through coordinated and facilitated action as well. So I'll stop there. I know I've talked for a little while, but I'm happy to also kind of touch back on some of the COP26 asks later on. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Sanjula. That was really interesting. All right, our last speaker this evening is a personal hero of mine. I am pleased to introduce you all to Annika Reynolds. Annika is a young queer leader in the environment movement, advocating for a more inclusive vision of climate justice. They founded GreenLaw in 2019 and are its ongoing CEO, as well as the inaugural youth chair of the Environment and Human Rights Subcommittee of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. Now, as well as founding an NGO, Annika is also a current student at the ANU doing her law honours. She also is just finishing up an international security studies degree at the ANU as well. Welcome, Annika.
Thank you, Peter. And just an FYI for everyone, my pronouns are they, them, and I appreciate the understanding. So it just popped up on my Twitter feed because I'm new to Twitter and it's very sad that I'm so excited about it already, that Australia has been named the fossil of the day for the first day of COP26, which I think really summarises how I'm sure everyone approaching this panel kind of feels about Australia's involvement in COP26 and the legacy that we kind of bring into COP26, and unfortunately the undermining actions that we are continuing at COP26. And that has some really serious human rights implications. Ultimately, the climate crisis is a human rights crisis. And I want to outline why that is the case in two major ways. So the climate crisis is a human rights crisis for its impact on all of our human rights in a really negative way. We've recognised for a long period of time, in fact, since Gabčíkovo-Nagy-Maris, an International Court of Justice case, way back before I was even born, that the environment underpins the achievement of all of our human rights and indeed all of the principles of international law that allow us to function as a civilization. And that's only become more apparent with climate change. Climate change impacts our right to life and dignity. It impacts the rights of our Indigenous and Pacific Islander communities for self-determination, to engage in decolonisation and to see all of their rights flourish. And it also, during disasters, has particular impacts on marginalised communities. So we have research that shows that after natural disasters, violence against women and non-binary persons spikes. After natural disasters, LGBTIQA+ people are more likely to face discrimination in the responses that they seek and the supports that they seek, and they're also more likely to face violence. This is also the case for people of colour, for Indigenous communities, for poorer communities. We know that the impacts of climate change are felt unequally and that they flow through to impeding all of our human rights. And I think that's a really important point to make in Australia, where the human rights and environment discussion is unfortunately in its early days, to be polite. I have a lot of discussions at Australian Lawyers for Human Rights about how we can communicate these issues in a way that matters to the Australian public. We only have 3 jurisdictions in Australia with human rights acts. Our courts don't regularly apply human rights law. Our federal government, as Tony mentioned earlier, there's exploration of a federal human rights act, but our federal government is against that at this stage. So it's really important as NGOs, as people that care about climate action, to really communicate why the climate crisis is a human rights crisis. And I think the most powerful framework around that is to communicate the fact that it impacts our right to life and dignity. It impacts our right to the highest attainable standard of health. And we've seen that in Australia. The 2019-2020 bushfires were a period of incredible tragedy. I think I just turned 20, so entering my golden decade where I was supposed to be having lots of fun. And I was having a conversation with my mother, who was asking me, you've been dating your partner for a while, are you considering kids? And I mean, I was 20, so no. But the thing that I thought of was my room was filled with smoke at that point in time. I was looking outside at red skies. I was wearing a mask while I was going to sleep. And in Canberra Hospital, near where I live, there was evidence coming out that there had been a spike in birthing complications because the hospitals weren't built to deal with the level of smog that was now coming through from the bushfires. And so I was having this conversation with my mother in the beginning of what is supposed to be a golden decade of my life, where there is incredible opportunity and joy, thinking about the tragedy of my first child potentially taking its first breath and choking. And I think that is at the heart of why the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, because it impacts all of the things that we are supposed to find joyful. It makes our lives harder. It risks our health and the lives of our children and our grandchildren. But the second reason that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis is because the current trajectory of government policy and action is denying us the joys of climate action. Climate action is a beautiful thing. When we talk about renewable energy, we are talking about types of energy that are not only cleaner, they don't have the same smog output of fossil fuels, but it's types of energy that can be community owned, that can empower communities to receive the dividends of climate action and to reap the benefits of community-based solutions to the climate crisis. When we talk about reforming agriculture, what we're talking about is allowing communities to come back and be involved in urbanized agriculture, in Indigenous-led agricultural outputs that don't have the same emissions portfolio. These are massive benefits to our communities, and they promote our human rights. They help us have a higher standard of health. They help us to live longer. They help us to fulfill our rights to culture and community, and to have jobs that are fulfilling and that are safe. So when I look at COP26, I see a human rights crisis that has been in the making for decades, and that is unfortunately ongoing. And it has those two dimensions. It's a human rights crisis because of the terrible impacts on our human rights that come from climate change. And it's a human rights crisis because our governments across the world are currently not taking the actions that are needed for us, the people, to benefit from climate action. But I do think there is hope. We have seen, even at this panel tonight, that young people, that marginalised communities are standing up and taking action. Globally, we have seen a massive voice rise up from civil society and from groups that are concerned about climate change from all sectors, off the back of, I must acknowledge, decades of advocacy from environmental advocates that have come before us as young people. And that is making an impact. The UN Secretary General said earlier this year that COP26 is the last best chance to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And whilst Australia is fossil of the day, Australia is also being iced out of a lot of the negotiations. The French are not happy with us, unsurprisingly. We're not seeing great levels of collaboration between Australia and the buddies it used to be able to rely on in these kind of COP negotiations. We're seeing countries like India come forwards with a net zero commitment by 2070. These are big moves. The international community is starting to recognise that this is a human rights crisis and that action must be taken. It's our responsibility as civil society, as the youth voice, as NGOs and academics to push more ambitious action and to push that second half of the human rights crisis to ensure that the dividends of climate action flow through to all communities that are potentially impacted by climate change.
Wonderful, Annika. Thank you so much. That was incredibly powerful. All right, well, after hearing from each of our speakers, we now get to the somewhat spicy part of the evening, which is the Q&A. I'll invite all of our speakers to put their videos back on if they are able to. Now, just a note to all the participants, everybody is welcome to submit their questions below using the Q&A function. I'll do my best to put your questions to the speakers, but I have also prepared some questions of my own just to get us started. All right, the first question I will probably think I'm going to pose to is Tony. All right, Tony, so Annika did a great summary there, and we've all been following the news and watching the government to and fro about attending and negotiating at COP26. In your perspective and in light of recent events, and what would your dream policy be that Australia would take to COP26? Now, I'll start with Tony, but any of the other speakers, please feel free to weigh in.
That's an interesting question. Thank you. I suppose I would expect our government to be committing to doing all things necessary to avert the climate disaster, which we all know is looming. The most recent reports from the IPCC is frightening, and we are playing around at the edges in this country, trying to prop up a failing coal and gas industry, when in fact we should be pouring all of our resources into the new technologies and into reforestation and all the things that we know. We don't have to invent anything. We don't have to continue to chase the unicorn of carbon capture and storage. We have to get on with doing the things that we know need to be done and doing them to the best of our ability. And so, in my perspective, from my perspective, my people, my neighbours, the other First Nations that exist on this continent have an incredibly wonderful gift of leadership to give if only anybody would listen. But the nature of colonialism is that we are put to one side and we are silenced. And so that's, you know, also I'd like to see that happen, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. So in the absence of that, I would, the dream policy, I suppose, would be one where Australia commits to doing all things necessary to achieve, to play our role in the urgent reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I've got coal seam gas emissions on the mind, not a little bit. I'm involved in the Narrabri gas case. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That is such a brilliant answer. If we could just roll back a couple steps to what you were saying about how we have all of the technology that we already need. We don't need to invest in anything else. I know, Annika, that you have recently done some work on this topic. What role do you see, Annika, renewable energy innovation and technology innovation play in climate action? What role does that have for the future?
Thank you for the question, Peter. I think just quickly, you know, building on what Tony has so eloquently stated, I think the one other thing that Australia really needs to do during this COP process is to stop sabotaging it. I don't think there's enough recognition at home in Australia how powerful we unfortunately are when it comes to undermining the entire process. At the last COP, it was our Kyoto carryover bullshit, to be quite frank, that Brazil jumped on, and it undermined a whole heap of, you know, work that was happening at that COP. And that was Australia. We are an influential middle power with very strong allies in the US and the UK typically. Whether that's current is, you know, another question. And that means that countries listen to us, and countries that don't want to take climate action follow Australia's footsteps. So Australia needs to stop sabotaging the COP as well. But on the technology point, I think, you know, we've heard a lot about technology, not taxes, and the idea that we need to be developing new technologies, emerging technologies that are going to magically save us in the next couple of decades. That happened in the 1990s and the 2000s. You know, renewable energy is a viable mechanism to get us off fossil fuels now. Research that GreenLaw did earlier this year on community scale batteries shows that we can actually be implementing higher levels of solar panels on our grid in Australia through the use of community scale batteries that can get us off coal faster. The biggest barrier to renewable energy uptake in Australia is not the solar panel technology or the hydro technology. It's actually poor regulation, and it is an aging transmission grid. So if you look above you, wherever you are, and you look at your poles and wires, chances are they're pretty old and they're not actually strong enough to handle the massive amounts of energy that solar panels and wind farms can produce. They're far more powerful than coal-fired power is. But with community scale batteries, you can actually create isolated microgrids, essentially, that allow you to bolster your renewable energy without having to knock over every pole and wire that exists. It's this incredible shortcut. And it comes with other massive benefits. Microgrids are better at withstanding bushfires. You can set them up in a small community, have it as a backup if the main grid does go, because there has been a bushfire impact or there's been a flood or a storm impact. And they don't have the massive environmental impacts. Your transmission wires, because they along lines end up just bisecting massive areas of native vegetation that have to be bulldozed to have the transmission wires pop up. Microgrids don't have those negative impacts. So essentially, we are in a position now in Australia and in every country virtually across the world to be rolling out current technologies that can get us off fossil fuels. The technology not taxes slogan is just the new denialism by the federal government.
Wonderful. That actually takes us right into a question from someone in the audience, from Rebecca. And they're talking about something I hear a lot from government and others who are not motivated to act on climate change is that Australia needs coal and fossil fuels for jobs and also for resources. What would you guys say? I'll pick someone at random. Folole, because you smiled at me. What would you say to these claims? It can be as sassy as you like.
I mean, something that I've heard quite often from our family in Hawaii, where, you know, this idea of like resource, and that, you know, it's not a resource, it's a source of abundance. And shifting that I guess that connection and understanding to the lands and the waters that we all have a responsibility as, especially for us settlers. So I guess that's all I wanted to, that's all I can share is that, you know, this isn't a resource, it's a source of abundance for all of us. And yeah.
Shifting that frame is really, really powerful. And actually, that sort of idea of what do we say to these climate deniers is a question that I had prepared for Sanjula, actually. More so saying in Australia and in my work, I hear a lot of people say, oh, climate change isn't going to affect me. You know, I'm in my little townhouse in Sydney. It doesn't matter for me. From that lens of sort of the overwhelming proportion of people all over the world who are going to be displaced by climate, considering that, what would you say to these people, Sanjula?
Thanks, Peter. I guess the 2020 bushfire season's where I would probably start. And I think that, so attribution science is a form of science that's continuing to develop. And what that science does is try to understand or assess the influence of climate change on a particular event. And I think that science has developed a lot and evolved a lot, and now scientists are able to, with better precision, identify whether a given event has been impacted by climate change or affected by climate change. And the research is suggesting that, at least with the bushfire season, for example, that those fires were 30% more intense or more likely because of climate change. And I think that already shows that Australians are being affected by climate change and are being impacted by climate change. We're just at the tip of the iceberg, but through the fires. But there are also other scenarios, and in Queensland, in Grantham, for example, there was a situation where a whole community had to be relocated in the context of floods. And so all of these different types of mobility are already happening as well. What we know is that it's easier to understand the influence of climate change on certain types of events and processes, such as heat waves, such as droughts, such as a sea level rise, because there are kind of greater scientific decision-making points to do that analysis. But even in the context of floods and storms as well, that science is developing and we're getting better at it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sanjula. Does anybody else have anything to add to that thought? That's okay. Oh, Annika?
Sorry, Peter. I think building on what Sanjula has just said about the impacts of climate change, I think, Rebecca, your question touches on a really important point about this idea that, yes, climate change is bad, I guess, but climate action is going to be so much worse for communities. That's kind of what is the assumption that's underpinning this idea that we need fossil fuels. And I think it's really important to recognise the impacts of climate change are not external to Australia's borders. They affect all of us. And I am willing to bet that every single person on this call has been personally affected by some kind of climate impact. The 2019-2020 bushfires alone probably captured 95% of us. And so I think it is disingenuous to act like the economic benefits of fossil fuels are equal to the massive human rights impacts of climate change in Australia. But the other thing that I think is disingenuous about Australia needing fossil fuels is that, first of all, the economic benefits of the fossil fuel industry are massively overplayed. They don't, McDonald's employs more people than the entire fossil fuel industry, and they pay bugger all taxes. So all this money goes overseas to Australian companies that don't pay any taxes, and the trickle down effects to employees are small. So they're not actually that fantastic for the community impact or the economic benefit that's felt by all of us in the community through tax redistribution or through employee spending that comes back into the economy. The fossil fuel industry doesn't contribute that much. And no one is saying that, tomorrow, November 3rd, we're turning off all fossil fuel power. We're going to go completely onto renewables. Our grid's not ready for that. Our economy is not ready for that. But we have a decade. A solar farm doesn't take 25 years to be built. It on average, it takes roughly 12 to 18 months to be fully operational. We've got plenty of time to plan the transition of fossil fuels. We know the impacts are massive. We know the benefits of fossil fuels are low, and the benefits of renewable energy on jobs, taxes, community empowerment, dividends from solar, rooftop solar, all massive. The benefits of change are significant. So Australia doesn't need fossil fuels. I would argue the major political parties need fossil fuel donations. That's a big part of their model. And that's where those talking points are coming from, because from a community level, fossil fuels don't give us much and they cost us a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you, Annika. That certainly is a lot to think about.
Could I just add something, Peter?
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. Welcome.
I have been involved or seen Indigenous land use agreements entered into by First Nations with respect to mining operations all over the country. And my observation is that even though those agreements often make provision for employment programs for Indigenous people, they are very rarely ever actually implemented, performed in accordance with the agreement. So there are a couple of issues. Firstly, my observation is that generally First Nations people don't like working in mines on their own country. The cost to them spiritually, it ends up being too great. Secondly, the nature of employment in mining camps is not healthy or safe for Aboriginal communities, with the fly-in, fly-out workers bringing all sorts of social problems. And thirdly, for the workers themselves, in central Queensland, many of the doctors' surgeries have signs up saying free coal dust inspections, free black lung inspections. So the workers themselves are paid a fair bit of money, but that's because it's extremely dangerous work, and their life expectancy is greatly reduced. And the fact that they are being used as fodder in the argument to delay the move away from fossil fuels is pretty sad. And my view is that their union has let them down. Instead of facilitating the transition out of this dangerous and unhealthy work, they're mobilising them to resist the transition in a way that just astounds me. Anyway, sorry, a few points I thought I'd add.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That actually brings me back to a thought that I've been mulling over over the last few weeks, and I had intended to ask you this evening, and that is, what is the role of the environmental movement in reconciliation? Because I understand, and as you've described in your talk and then just then, that First Nations peoples do have such a close and intimate relationship with the land and with water that that, you know, as you said, you know, you can't help but have self-determination, sovereignty, and the environment intertwined. So in that way, what kind of role does reconciliation play for environmentalism and vice versa?
I think I'll try and be as brief as possible. In the 90s, when I first started working in this sort of area, the environmental movement didn't behave very well at all, and they were abusing the relationships with First Nations communities and using First Nations as fronts, and then discarding the communities when the project failed or when the campaign fell over. I think that process has improved a lot, and I think that particularly the writings of Naomi Wolf have been well understood by the environmental movement, so that there's a much greater understanding that First Nations people have a much stronger, more principled, well appreciated standpoint from which to make environmental arguments than the colonists and the settlers. And so it's still difficult, my observation, it's still difficult for many environmental groups to just be supporters and not try and manipulate the direction of the campaigns, but they're getting better at it. And so in a practical sense, there is a very real role of reconciliation that needs to happen within the environmental movement as regards First Nations, so that there's an understanding that we need to lead and make decisions, and they need to be respectful enough to accept our decisions as to how we wish to deal with the problems that are occurring on our lands and waters.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. The next question, sort of on a similar vein, I had thought of for Lole. And that is, so, you know, we've spoken a little bit about through that question how how Australian environmentalists particularly can be allies to First Nations peoples and to help support their human rights. What can Australian environmentalists also do to support Pacific communities?
I mean, I guess I want to first know that, like, Australia, First Nations people are part of the Pacific, are part of the Oceania region. And so, you know, it is unsettling for the leaders of this government to continue belittling the Pacific leaders and the people of the Pacific time and time again, like every COP, even at the Pacific Island Forum as well. And so, you know, like there is this collective solidarity amongst the Pacific peoples and First Nations of this country, as well as, you know, First Nations of Aotearoa, the Māori, and it's, you know, it's existed way before colonization. And so, you know, I think your question, it's like, it's the relationship and has always been here amongst the peoples. And so, I mean, it's just a shame. Well, not a shame. I'm actually really angry that it's, you know, the Morrison government, and even before Morrison, who to continue to, you know, not see the collaboration and the how willing Pacific peoples are in always including First Nations people and even the Australian government in the work that they do. And so, yeah. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Your anger is so empowering and refreshing, and it actually reminds me a lot of the address that Sir David Attenborough gave at the start of COP when he was talking about the sort of the youth environmental movement and the anger that comes with that. And so I guess this next question or topic of discussion is for you, Annika, and for Lole. So David Attenborough said, perhaps the fact that people most affected by climate change are no longer some imagined future generation, but young people alive today, perhaps that will give us the impetus we need to rewrite the story. So considering that, you know, anger and the rebellion that youth have and this sort of impetus that the youth represent to the climate movement, what role do you see young people playing in a global eco-revolution?
Well, I think, you know, I very much echo Falole's anger here, although it comes from obviously a slightly different perspective. Earlier this year, we had Sharma and Minister for the Environment handed down, and Justice Bromberg very eloquently said what I think many young people feel, which is the idea that climate justice is the greatest intergenerational injustice inflicted from the current ruling class on the next generation and all generations to come. And I do want to recognise that being an older person doesn't mean you're, you know, automatically implicated in this. We've had activists for decades, Tony sitting on the paddle, you know, working in this space. There is a real intergenerational equity component in the environmental movement. But this is an injustice that is being actively, negligently inflicted on young people. And as young people, we are the leaders of today and tomorrow in fighting for justice and the solutions to climate change. And I think there's also it's very important to recognise that more than any other generation, it is this current generation of youth that are saying that climate solutions are all well and good, but they should have come in the 1980s. You know, the time is for climate accountability. When I look at COP26 and I look at what I want to come out of COP26, of course I want to see emissions cuts, but I also want to see recognition that the current leaders that are sitting at COP26 are committing ecocide. You know, it's a crime that we're starting to develop in the international space, but you can't deny that the way the Australian government is conducting itself crosses those thresholds. And so as young people, what we are advocating for and what we are leading the charge on is the recognition that climate action at this point is needed, is necessary, but climate change is still going to be felt, and it will be felt by my generation and all generations to come. And that means that climate accountability is also needed. And I think that is the fight that we are increasingly having as young people that are in the courts in Sharma, or that the recent case that's been led by Environmental Justice Australia to the UN Human Rights Committee. Young people are calling for accountability, and that's the role that I think we can play in the climate justice story. Is we are the solutions to climate change, and we are also the generation that is going to hold leaders to account for what they have done to lead us to this point.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's really nothing I can add. That was like spot on, Annika. But I guess just one little thing is that, you know, we move forward because we acknowledge the past and the present, and we acknowledge the importance of our elders, as well as with us, Tony McAvoy. And, you know, without acknowledging our elders and our ancestors before us, you know, it becomes a crisis for young people, especially now, and especially those in diaspora. And so, yeah, spot on, Annika.
Yeah.
Can I just add something?
Absolutely.
From my perspective, it's more than just convincing our leaders to make the difficult decisions in terms of the transition away from greenhouse gas emission, and it's about my generation and the generation before me, and the rampant consumerism and exploitation of our natural resources. And we're seeing massive deforestation. We're seeing species extinction at some incredible rate. And I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I am given heart by her ferocity and determination not to become what my generation has been. And you know, so that's really where my hope lies. And it's a really difficult conversation for Indigenous people to have, and people in poorer countries, where you have to say, you look at the Western world around you and you say, okay, well, all of these people are using our country and our labour and our resources to create these things of wealth and luxury for themselves, but we know better. But how do we not fall into the trap of pursuing those things and coveting those outcomes? It's very difficult, and it's very difficult for Aboriginal communities to make the decisions to reject the promise of jobs for the protection of country when people are so impoverished. So sorry, there's a little diversion, but I have hope in my daughter's generation.
Thank you for sharing. That's so wonderful. I think we have time just for one more question, so I'll take one from the audience here. And that is, to what extent could new treaties or conventions be developed to guide or mandate the apportioning of costs for adequate measures to combat the global climate crisis according to the UN recognized polluter pays principle? So they've referenced in their question that this could be similar to health or legal obligations, drawing on historical profiteering by asbestos or tobacco companies rather than hitting the Earth's vulnerable and low emissions citizens and taxpayers, exposing them to further intergenerational damage and loss. So that's a big question there. Would anybody like to weigh in?
It can be done. Sorry, Annika, I'll just say briefly, it can be done. There's no impediment to there being some global agreement under the auspices of the UN to provide for certain contributions to be made. Enforcing it might be a little bit difficult, as with all things UN, but certainly that type of agreement could be entered into, and we're seeing a kind of a form of that with the proposal for the EU carbon border tax. I know that's not the right name, and the discussions about the same sort of border tax in the US. So I don't think that it's something out of the question. Certainly, I think that the current situation where Australia is opting out of the global scheme so it can use grants to the Pacific nations as some form of manipulation is despicable. It's terrible standover type tactics. Yes, it can be done, is my view, in short.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Tony. It can be done, but will it be done? You know, we've had the Green Climate Fund for years now that has been set up basically to do a similar thing. It's supposed to have $100 billion in it by now to be redistributed amongst developing countries to help deal with the impacts of climate change and to deal with the transition to net zero. And we haven't seen that level of funding flow through. And so I think there's a real issue, even today, listening to a lot of the national speeches that were happening at COP26, there's a bit of a Western saviourship model that's being perpetrated here, this idea of, oh, we're helping developing countries, et cetera, et cetera. And look, diplomacy is diplomacy, but I think it's important that we all recognise that the things like the Green Climate Fund are at their heart, as you said in your question, they're reparations for historical emissions, for ongoing colonisation, for extractivism that is happening predominantly in the global south for the benefit of the global north, and predominantly in poorer communities in the global north for the benefit of richer communities in the global north. So there's a real issue of political will. And I think the one other thing I'll touch on very quickly is, you mentioned asbestos and lead and the profiteering that happened in those companies, which I absolutely agree with. And I think we have to recognize that, you know, I think it's 70 companies in the world are responsible for 70% of global emissions. Companies are not neutral actors in climate change. Fossil fuel companies have, you know, engaged in donations, lobbying, propaganda for decades to delay action. And so there needs to be an international agreement or framework to address that. But the big challenge for companies is that they all have limited shareholder liability. And so we've seen that in asbestos and lead time and time again, that, you know, James Hardie set up a shell company like that to allegedly pay out all of the claims, the tortious claims from people that were affected by asbestos. And that company had, I think it was 1% or 2% of the amount of money that was actually needed to pay out those claims, and the company got away with it. So, you know, when it comes to reparations and the flow of money that's actually needed to do justice, we have countries that need to engage in that reparations work and the political will there. But I think we also have a deeper question in the West of reforming the very companies that engage in these actions and ensuring that they also pay their fair share, and how we go about that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Annika. And what a powerful note to leave it on. I have been made aware that the clock has struck 8:30 and that we have to wrap up. I'd like to thank the panelists and the audience members for staying on a little bit longer. I'd like to again thank each of our speakers, Tony, Falole, Sanjula, and Annika. I encourage each and every one of you, including the panelists and the audience tonight, to add your voice to the discussion on human rights and COP26 as best that you can. Just going around to each of the speakers in turn, if each of you could sort of just give a shout out to an action point that someone from the audience could take this evening for the climate movement. For Lole, we could start with you.
I think you shared it in the comment, the signing of the declaration, but I think I might actually pass it to Sanjula, because I haven't heard much. Yeah. So if Sanjula wanted to speak, yeah.
I think it's hard for me to, thanks Falole, it's hard for me to think of an action point directly on the audience, but what I want to say is that one of the key things from a mobility perspective is ensuring that finance gets to the most developed countries, so that the adaptation frameworks within the most developed countries can be sufficiently financed. So to the extent that you can engage in actions that are promoting efforts to ensure that finance gets to the countries that are most affected by climate change and disasters, to support adaptation measures, I think that's another area of key action, because much of the discussion is focused on mitigation, as it should be, but equally in the current environment, the impact people are facing, these impacts now, and being able to adapt to those impacts is necessary. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, is there anywhere specifically that the audience can go to find out more online, somewhere we could donate or sign a petition or anything like that?
Thanks, Peter. Let me think about that. I don't know, but I'll come back to you, and then you can maybe share it with the people who are participants later.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, Tony, any last action items you'd like to leave the audience with tonight?
Yes, briefly, you could all join the First Nations Clean Energy Network launch on the 16th of November. It's being launched in Alice Springs. It's an online launch with some speakers and things happening on the 16th of November, 17th of November. It's a network of First Nations people interested in pursuing clean energy options for our communities.
Wonderful. And Annika, any last key action items for the audience from you?
Thank you, Peter. I think there are two action items. One is join a community group engaging in this space. What we have seen time and time again is that collective action is the key to making a difference in the climate space. So wherever your passions lie, find a community group in that space, get involved. And I think the other thing is I'm the only white person on this panel, which I think is fantastic for intersectionality. And I want to say to the white people in this audience that we've had a fantastic opportunity to listen to First Nations, Pacific, and the voice of people of colour tonight. And to take that and to continue to educate yourself. There is tons of information online from activists and academics that come from First Nations and Pacific groups about what justice means to them, what kinds of reform we should be supporting First Nations people in the Australian context and in the international context, and to also go, that step further and actually start to learn what Indigenous value systems are when it comes to environmental management and to caring for country and to returning to country. There's plenty of information out there, and I think it's very important that we leave this panel as white people, as people that have grown up in a colonial mindset that is absolutely the root cause of climate change, to start to treat this as an impetus for decolonisation of the self. It's something that it's a journey I'm still going on, and it's a really positive journey to connect to community and to learn about new ways of working together for that decolonial future, for that climate justice future that we're all striving for.
Wonderful. And an action item from me, of course, is for everybody to go online. The link is in the chat right at the top there. I'm sure someone will pop it in again and sign Amnesty's petition. If we could just have a small thank you from Amnesty as well, and then it will be good to go. So Sam?
Thanks. Yes, thank you, Peter. Sorry, my camera's not coming on. Thank you, Peter. And a huge, huge, huge thank you to all of the panelists this evening. I really enjoyed your wisdom and your passion, as I'm sure that our audience did as well. And, I can't encourage everyone enough of the need to keep amplifying one another's voices. I completely agree that collective action is where our impact will be. So we need to amplify one another's voices and the voices of all aligned activists and all of the good work that's happening in this space. Unfortunately, we're working against a degree of apathy and ignorance in our country on both levels, on the human rights level and on the level of climate change. So we have a double whammy when we're talking about advocating in this area. So it's, education is the key. And I agree with some of the points that Tony and Annika made in that my hope is also in young people. And I went to a children's play forum this week where I saw a childcare centre that was their 3-year-olds had curriculum on human rights, and their 4-year-olds had curriculum on climate change and on healing country. And these are the change makers that are coming up that will make a huge difference, and it's important again that we amplify those voices. So thank you to everyone who asked questions, and let's keep the conversation alive and continue to give strength to one another around this absolutely critical issue.
What a great message to leave things on. Well, thanks again everybody for sharing your Tuesday evening with us. Thanks again to our wonderful speakers, and enjoy the rest of COP26.